Hi, good evening. I'm Father Alexander. This is St. Peter's in Hove. Welcome to our 83rd step in our walking tour through the Bible. And today we're just going to look at one chapter. It's the 8th chapter of the first book of Samuel, which is entitled in my version, The People Ask for a King. Now, when I used to be a teacher of history, people would often say, yes, where does the king get his power from? Well, he inherits it from his father. And then the children would say, yes, but the first king, where did he get his power from? And the answer is, well, the first king didn't inherit it from his father. He was the first king. His father was just a nobody, or not a king anyway. So the first king presumably was appointed, elected, or acclaimed. And they would say very rightly, well, in that case, why didn't all kings get elected? Why don't you have an elected head of state? Why do you have to have a hereditary head of state? And I'd have to explain why it is that in ancient times, and even today in some places, people prefer a hereditary head of state to an elected or appointed head of state. Don't forget, we live in a world in which there are elected heads of state, appointed heads of state, or elected by the parliament or something, and hereditary heads of state. Now, the people ask for a king, and they say quite clearly, they go to Samuel. First of all, they say to Samuel, "You are old." Nice little reminder to us that everybody has their day. Even Samuel, who's been great in his day, is now to be cast aside on the grounds that he is old. His sons, who he's appointed as judges, do not follow in his ways. They take bribes. We don't want you anymore. We don't want your sons anymore. So Samuel, in disappointment, no doubt, goes to the Lord to consult the Lord. He is, after all, the seer, the prophet. And he comes back and he says to the people, well, you can have your king, but please beware of what is going to happen. And Samuel then explains what kings do. And what kings do is this. I mean, there are many things that kings do, but these are the things that Samuel homes in on. He says, this is what the king who is to reign over you will do. He will take your sons and direct them to his chariotry and cavalry, and they will run in front of his chariots. He will use them as leaders of thousands and leaders of fifties. He will make them plough his fields and gather in his harvest, and make his weapons of war and his gear for his chariots. He will take your daughters as perfumers, cooks, and bakers. He will take the best of your fields, your vineyards, and your olive groves, and give them to his officials. He will tithe your crops and vineyards to provide for his courtiers and officials. He will take the best of your servants, men and women, of your oxen and your donkeys, and make them work for him. He will tithe your flocks, and you yourselves will become his slaves. That day you will cry aloud because of the king you have chosen for yourselves. But on that day, the Lord will not listen to you. This is obviously what went on in most ancient Near Eastern kingdoms. There's nothing you can say that's extraordinary in this description. It's a hostile description. All Samuel is saying is the king will have conscription. And the reason they want a king, as it later turns out, is so he will lead them in battle. So the real reason why kings emerge is because they're originally battle leaders, you see. He'll have conscription. He'll have taxation. He'll have servants. You will serve him. He will be king. You will be subjects. He will be the master. You will be the slaves. He will make you take, and he'll also use you for forced labor. There'll be taxation via money, but there'll also be what in English is called, well, in French is called la corvée. That is to say, the feudal system. You will have to work on the king's land for no pay at all. You'll be helots. You will be serfs. You will be slaves. In other words, you will have a system which is common to the whole of humanity. And that was a system, for example, that was the case in Britain, let's say, in the Middle Ages. You had to work on the Lord's land. You had to pay tithes to the Lord and so on. And in return, he protected you and he led you in battle. Not much of a return, you might think. But there again, the Israelites have been oppressed by the Philistines for a long time. They've had various foreign oppressors. So maybe that's what makes them want a king. Then he says this, the people, however, refused to listen to Samuel, said, no, we're determined to have a king so we can be like other nations, with our own king to rule us and lead us and fight our battles. So the people want to be part of a kingdom, part of a monarchy. The people no longer want to be part of a theocracy, that is to say, a place ruled by God. Though was Israel before the monarchy in fact a theocracy? We don't really know. Was Israel, as it's portrayed in these books, a pleasant sort of anarchy? We don't really know. Were the judges not kings? No, they weren't kings. They were sort of elected officials. But certainly, was there a kingdom? No, there was a loose confederation of tribes, is what most people think. In fact, there was what anarchist theorists would call anarchy. That is to say, the maximum personal freedom and the minimum of state intervention. Well, nowadays we've got to ask ourselves, what sort of political system do we want? And we may ask ourselves this, but we really don't have a choice. We're born into the country we're born in, and often we have to put up with what we find there. But this is the interesting thing, I think, that sticks out in this passage more than anything else. We want to be like all the other nations. We don't want to have our own individual gift from God, our own individual way of being. We want to be like the other nations. The other nations, they know best. Now, what you see here essentially is a looking forward. We want to be like the other nations. We want to be like the Canaanites. We want to be like the Philistines. We want to be like the Babylonians. And a looking back, we actually want to be like we were in Egypt, because after all, it was Pharaoh who had all these perfumers, charioteers and so on, and all these cooks and bakers. It was Pharaoh. Pharaoh did actually have a baker, if you remember, back in the book of Exodus. It was Pharaoh who had the chariots and the people running in front of his chariots. I think there's also a little bit of condemnation here, quite a strong level of condemnation, the flummery and the show of monarchy. You've got to have people running in front of your chariot. Why? Why do you have to have people running in front of your chariot? You've got to have, people bowing and scraping. You've got to have courtiers. The idea is that all these people who are paid for by taxation are pretty useless. We could do without them. The other thing about the monarchy is everything the monarchy spends is paid for, but it's not paid for by the monarch. It's paid for by the common people who pay the taxes. And of course, looking forward to King Solomon in all his glory was in fact paid for by the common people who later revolted against King Solomon's son. So it's very strange, isn't it, that the first real sort of republican declaration is to be found in this ancient text, the Bible. And of course, since the time of the monarchy, since the Babylonian exiles, the Jewish nation has not had a king. The Jews have not had a single central leader, and nevertheless, in their diaspora, and also today in the state of Israel, they've done rather well. Despite that, they've maintained their unique character. So the monarchy in Israel is in fact quite an aberration, because it dates from the time of King Saul through to the time of King Jeconiah, which is roughly 700 years. But before and after, no monarchy, and it's all carried on. We've got to realize that earthly glory passes, but the word of God stays forever. Interesting, eh? I hope you found it so. All the very best. Bye.